All right. Hello, class, and welcome to Lecture 19. This week we are talking about climate change. Of course, we're not debating whether climate change is real or is happening. Instead, we are talking about our own personal responsibilities in relationship to climate change. In our previous lecture, we talked about procreation and whether or not having children is morally acceptable in light of environmental challenges. Today we're going to be talking about individual responsibility, namely, do we have an individual responsibility to alter our own behavior in order to curb climate change? So a couple of learning objectives for you today. First, and let me be clear, in this lecture we're going to be covering we're going to be looking at a lot of ethical principles. In essence, we're going to be trying to identify what it means to cause harm. When do your actions harm another person? And to help us consider that in light of climate change, we're going to be basically funneling through a bunch of different principles to see which, if any of them, can be used in this specific argument. So I would like for you to know these principles, maybe not memorize them. You don't need to know necessarily their definition, but be able to talk about how one could use them or how they differ from each other. And then finally, be able to explain what Walter Sinnott Armstrong's argument is against the individual responsibility for climate change. So let's get started here today, starting about individual responsibility. At this point, you should have read Sinnott Armstrong's paper. He admits that climate change is a problem, and he admits that governments have an obligation to do something about it. But he claims that it does not follow from the fact that there is responsibility at the group level, but there is also responsibility at the individual level. And what he's saying here, the group level is essentially the government level. He is arguing that climate change should be tackled, but it should be tackled by governments. And if governments fail, it does not fall on the individuals to pick up where the governments have failed. So he asks us to consider two examples. So the first is a bridge that you come across, and you stop your car, you get out, you look at it, and you notice that the bridge is crumbling. It's in disrepair. And as you look around and you see all the cars passing, you know that if someone doesn't do something about this problem soon, there's going to be a major disaster. That bridge is going to collapse, and a lot of unsuspecting drivers are going to plummet, probably to their death. So, do you, as an individual who sees this problem, do you have some responsibility to help to repair it? Or, imagine a scenario which probably strikes us a little bit closer to home. So imagine that the government has suspended its public education programs. Just flat out stopped them. Children across the country are not going to school. They're no longer learning reading and writing and arithmetic. Does it follow that I, as an individual, have some responsibility to teach my children these things that they are no longer learning at school? Now, if you think about these two scenarios, the bridge and the school, I think we would come to different conclusions about what our responsibility in each case is. Sinnott Armstrong suggests that while it is plausible that I do have some responsibility to teach my children the things that they're missing at school, it is not plausible that I have some responsibility to fix the bridge in that first case. So perhaps only sometimes an obligation at the group level transfers to a responsibility at the individual level. So if the group level does not do what it's supposed to do, if the group, the schools, the government do not teach our children, then yeah, it probably does fall upon parents and leaders, grandparents, guardians, to provide that type of education. But if a government does not fix a bridge, Does it fall on us as individuals to fix that bridge? No, probably not. So how do we explain that difference? Right? Because in ethics, that's what we're looking for. We recognize that different scenarios rely on different factors, that our response to them hinge upon some unwritten, perhaps unwritten rules. So in this case where the group has failed to do its responsibility, does it fall on the individual to step up? And what we're coming to, what Sinai Armstrong argues, is that it depends. But why does it depend? And what are those categories upon which it depends? How do we know if an individual should have responsibility or not? So this is what Sinai Armstrong is going to try to explain, because ultimately he looks at this and he says, okay, where does climate change fall into these two categories? If the government is not working to mitigate climate change, do I have some responsibility as an individual to do my part to mitigate the problem? So one way that we can look at this is, imagine it's a Sunday afternoon, the weather is beautiful, not too hot, not too humid, a nice breeze, maybe the seasons are changing. Is it okay for me to take a joyride in my gas-guzzling, polluting SUV just for the fun of it? And this is the question, because it sums up so neatly this idea of group versus individual responsibility. So if the government is doing nothing about climate change, do I have a responsibility? So specifically, if given the chance to joyride in my SUV, is it okay for me to do that? Or do I have an individual responsibility not to? That's going to be the question that the rest of our conversation hinges on. We're going to start by looking at what it means to cause harm. When is harm done? And what are some categories, some characteristics by which we can define what harm is and when it takes place? Because if we can identify whether or not our actions are harming other people, then perhaps that has some impact on whether or not a group responsibility can become an individual responsibility. So next up, let's talk about what is the harm principle, and is it your fault?